Hello, everyone. Hello. Hello and welcome to the 2023 SABR Analytics Conference. I got to say, it is really great to be back in person after a 3-year hiatus. You may have noted we're in a new venue. I'd like to thank the Arizona State University Sports Law and Business Program for their partnership in putting on this year's conference. That partnership includes the wonderful AV capabilities in this room, which are allowing us to stream the conference to more than 300 students joining us from across the world. In any new space, there's always a need to identify where things are located, so I'll try to help you out a little bit with that. If you're looking for restrooms, you will find them behind the seating of the Great Hall. So you can go down either hallway here. There's also restrooms available on this side on the second floor. If you feel like this room is a little too crowded for you, or you need to step away, maybe catch up on some emails or something like that, room 250 on the second floor is available for use, and we're streaming the Zoom into that room. So you won't miss anything if you need to step away for a little bit. If you need help finding your way around the facility, SABR staff is available. Scott Carter, Jacob Pomeranke, Jessica Smith, Ken Corrado are around to help you guys as necessary. As discussions and presentations conclude, questions may be asked by queuing up at the microphone here in the center of the room. And for those of you joining us on Zoom, you can use the webinar question chat function in that Zoom meeting to ask questions online. While this time is set aside for the conference welcome, we've already actually had a day and a half of programming. Yesterday, all of our student attendees were able to participate in sessions designed to help them develop their skill set as well as network with one another. I'd like to thank Sports Info Solutions for their support of that programming, along with Sean Lehman of SABR, Jonah Gardner and Zoe Surma of Baseball Reference, Shauna Shee of Major League Baseball, David Highland of Xavier University, and Nick Wan of the Cincinnati Reds for sharing their knowledge with the students. Earlier today, 20 high school and college students competed in the Diamond Dollars case competition. Thanks to SABR Analytics Conference co-founder and MLB consultant Vince Gennaro for organizing the competition. You can catch an encore presentation from the winning team from WashU in St. Louis here tomorrow morning. Over the next 3 days, we will enjoy 14 research presentations spanning a wide range of baseball-relevant research domains. We will also hear from a variety of personalities from throughout the industry during panel discussions, which will dissect some of the most topical issues in the game today. We'll also spend time celebrating the contributions of researchers with the SABR Analytics Conference Research Awards and the SABR Analytics Conference Lifetime Achievement Award. Of course, the weekend would not be complete without the opportunity to network with one another. So I hope you'll join us tonight, as well as Saturday and Sunday morning for organized networking sessions, in addition to catching up during downtime throughout the conference. Before we get started today, there are a host of organizations and individuals I'd like to thank for helping make this event possible. First, thanks to our presenting sponsors, Rawlings and Major League Baseball. Part of Major League Baseball's support provides scholarships to attend the conference virtually and in person to more than 130 students from MLB's Diversity Pipeline program. Welcome to all of you. I'd also like to thank our supporting sponsors, Sports Info Solutions, Baseball Reference, Rapsodo, SMT, the University of Pacific's Eberhart School of Management, Baseball Cloud, Cleat Street Capital, and this session's sponsor, Kinatrax. And thanks to our team sponsors, the Arizona Diamondbacks, Chicago Cubs, Cleveland Guardians, and Colorado Rockies. The SABR Analytics Conference Research Awards are supported by the efforts of the editorial teams at Fangraphs and Baseball Prospectus, as well as the IBWAA. Of course, none of this would exist without research presentations. Thanks to our research presentation selection committee led by Sports Info Solutions and committee members Joe Rosales, Mark Simon, Sarah Thompson, Jackson Lewis, Graham Goldbeck, Phil Birnbaum, Meg Rowley, Louis Paulus, Meredith Wills, Harry Pavlidis, and Jason Thiemanson. Without further ado, it's time to start the 2023 SABR Analytics Conference. Come on up, guys. Our first panel comes to us thanks to the American Baseball Biomechanics Society, and is a discussion about the integration of biomechanics in baseball ops. Our panelists today are Colin Cahill, Vice President, Player Performance and Wellness with the San Francisco Giants, and Roger Caplinger, recently retired Vice President, Medical Operations, Health and Safety with the Milwaukee Brewers. Our moderator is Ethan Stewart, Lead Sports Scientist and Biomechanist with the Oakland A's. Take it away, Ethan.
Thank you, Scott. First, welcome everyone. Thanks for being here. I'm part of the American Baseball Biomechanics Society. We're very excited to give this talk about the integration of biomechanics into baseball ops. Before we dive into biomechanics, first I want to let the panel introduce themselves just a tad bit more, get a little more info about what their background is and what we're doing. So Colin, if you'd like to go first.
Sure. Nice to meet you all. Can you guys hear me okay with this? Okay, now.
Yeah. Is that better? There we go. Yeah, awesome. So nice to meet you. Colin Cahill with the Giants, Player Performance and Wellness. In my role, I manage our performance science and sports science groups and oversee efforts more broadly related to technology and health. I work closely with our sports medicine group, with our coaching staff, and with our front office. And prior to joining the Giants, I spent 20 years working in healthcare technology, both with startups as an investor and an entrepreneur, looking at medical technology, biotechnology, and helping to develop new ideas and new technologies to bring them forward for the healthcare system. So I have a non-traditional background, joined the Giants about 4 years ago.
Roger?
Yeah, my name is Roger Caplinger, former Vice President of Medical Operations, Health and Safety for Milwaukee Brewers. Been with the Brewers my whole entire career, 33 years. Started as a minor league athletic trainer, major league head athletic trainer, then vice president of medical. Oversee medical operations, strength and conditioning, sports psychology, sports performance for the Brewers for a number of years. My good friend Bryson Nakamura couldn't be here today, started our sports science department. So trying to put everything under one umbrella for our organization so we don't work in silos, and trying to answer the question of player performance and how to perform over a 162 game schedule.
Cool. Yeah. And like Roger said, Bryson was supposed to be the moderator. So for lack of better terms, I was the call to the bullpen today. So I'll be answering questions and moderating. I am Ethan Stewart. I'm the lead sports scientist and biomechanist for the Oakland Athletics. Last year, I was the applied biomechanist for the Cincinnati Reds. The 2 years before that, I was the player performance facilitator for the Baltimore Orioles. The 2 years before that, I was an intern with the Rays. So I've had quite a bit of movement. I'm going to bring in a lot of ideas and different things from my different points of view across the organizations. So as we talk about these things, you'll see kind of my mix of backgrounds from the different groups. First, I want to start with the panel. What has been your experience with biomechanics, and why do you see this as a valuable tool for organizations?
Yeah, so to keep this informal, I think being the old guy here, we started working with biomechanical motion analysis probably 25 years ago from the Medical College of Wisconsin in the GATE lab. And we started asking questions. And I think that's one of the things that I can emphasize to this group is asking the right questions in a collaborative effort to try to answer a question. And so my question was to our physicians and our biomechanists previously was, how does the attrition of shoulder and elbow injuries across the game, as you well know, you see guys getting Tommy Johns at alarming rates. And so how do we answer these questions with biomechanics feeding that from the validity and reliability of that information to help me as a clinician and to translate that to our performance staff or our coaching staff of how to dose throwing over longitudinal period of time, right? We just don't want guys throwing hard for 2 weeks. We need them, if you're a starter, 34 times a year, or you're a reliever, hopefully 60 times a year. So we need to understand how to do that longitudinally and expound on that to understand that we need to do that for 150 athletes. And so my experience with that is asking the right questions of not only starting with pitchers because they're the easiest, but understanding pitchers on the mound, valgus stress on their UCL, shear force and torque on their shoulder, and then doing that in a kinetic chain of ground force reaction, as well as what they do other than throwing on the mound, right? We all know that pitchers are this weird creature that they do other stuff, notably not doing PFPs or stuff like that. But when we've taken the bat out of their hands, thank goodness. So that reduces injury because we know once they get off that dirt mound, they're not athletes. But what they do is they do long toss, right? And they all think that they need to throw 300 feet. Well, maybe some guys can't throw 300 feet and they're all competitors. So how do we, 20 years ago, did a long toss study and then came up with this player-centric model to understand each player, that Colin's going to throw 120 feet while Ethan's going to throw 150, because we know from biomechanics that their standard deviations went up twofold. So that's how we at the Brewers tailor-made each player-centric model in biomechanics. And I think that's where we learned. And we were on the forefront of learning and we were evolving with it. And we're trying to learn as we are in competition. And that's really hard, right? That's really hard to do while you're in competition.
Colin?
That was a really interesting answer. I think for us, part of the use case for biomechanics is along the lines Roger described, like very research focused and trying to enable us to ask and answer new questions. And then a big chunk of it is actually just supporting our players day to day as well. We can ask questions about health. We can ask questions about performance and how they relate to how the body moves. And it's really powerful, just kind of day in and day out. I think there's a third piece of it, which is really important for us now, which is to kind of increasingly build the understanding of biomechanics across the organization. So across sports medicine group, across the coaching staff, just that ongoing education, so that it's kind of part of what everybody thinks about. It's not like a kind of small group of folks. So I'd say those three areas: research, the supporting players, education. And we're now at the point when, a lot of the organizations are starting to scale it, where it's maybe initially started very, very custom, very one-off, and now looking to do things on a broader basis across the org.
Yeah, great. So selfishly, I'm going to say biomechanics is important because it gives me a job. But for me, it's been really interesting because I am a little later to the game in terms of sports science and biomechanics. So for me, it's about being able to work with the organization to help individualize what we're doing for each athlete. We know each athlete's different. We know what they're doing is different. We know how they throw is different. No two deliveries are the exact same. So we're able to figure out what's going on with them and be able to work with the medical staff, with the strength and conditioning staff to build independent programs for those athletes so that we're getting on the best work that we possibly can. As this data becomes more and more accessible across the organization, we're seeing that this is starting to come out where we're able to dive into it in the public domain. It's really important for us to be able to have these conversations so that we understand it. So for me, it's building the relationships, building those communication bridges, which we'll get into a little bit later in this, but building a way for us all to have a conversation around it throughout the organization so that it's not just the sports science staff. It's not just the biomechanist who has this information, because it is so valuable and it is so useful for all of these different areas. It's useful for analytics if you're building models, if you're trying to understand pitch design, if you're trying to understand what we're doing for projections. We can add it into all these different aspects. So for me, that's what's the most exciting, is you're seeing this grow and you're seeing it build so that we can build it into a lot of different areas around an organization. And I've seen that across 4 orgs, so I'm not trying to give away anything that we're doing, but just how I've seen it throughout the league so far. So my second question, looking at this, so with biomechanics, because Roger, you were able to see it from a very beginning stage within baseball, what were the expectations when you first dove into those questions, and what were the first years like? What were you getting out of this information?
Yeah, I think it's about being transparent and building a culture. You know, we have this player-centric model, and to your point, not giving away what every organization does, because we're competing against 29 other clubs, right? We want to win a World Series. The Giants do, the A's do. And so the Milwaukee Brewers try to build this culture of transparency and this player-centric model to understand that the players in the middle of this, and then strength and conditioning, team physicians, medical staff, psych staff, sports science staff are all in the periphery, along with coaching staff. And I think that was the hardest buy-in initially, was the coaching staff, right? It's go with the medical staff and do this, and then come back to me with an output, right? And so the old proverb of once a player, always a player. So all of our coaches were former players, right? So they relied on the eye test. They said, oh, you're falling too forward down the mound. You're not staying back on the rubber. You need to put your arm slot, your release point. Well, now we have metrics for all of that, right? And so it's building that culture of the coaches, your manager, and then going above that to your front office and having them buy into that, because we initially ran into players that were like, I'm not doing that, because if I do that and I really am not good at that, you're going to release me. Not true, right? Not true. But how do we look at what you're doing biomechanically to actually help you perform better and to have a longevity of a career and to help us win championships and to make you earn a lot of money? That's how it was approached in the beginning. I mean, we've done several mound height studies, long toss studies, flat ground studies. We were one of the first clubs to do a telos elbow radiographic study, just to see how these guys are coming in. And now more and more, and not to allude to more discussion later, but, you know, we got 8 and 10-year-old kids playing select teams right now and multiple teams. And those entities are not talking. I know Dr. James Andrews was really good with USA Baseball about pitch counts and stuff, but we are seeing an immense amount of kids with a ton of mileage on their bodies at 17 years old, and Latin American kids at 14.
So I think one of your questions was, what were your expectations coming in, right?
Absolutely.
Which is pretty relevant for me, because I came in 4 years ago, kind of from outside. And I would say my expectations were pretty low. I mean, I was agnostic, but they were pretty low, because the concern I had was, is this going to be, you know, something that's very, very low scale, something that you can really do, you know, kind of around the margins, but not affect the team broadly. And, you know, I think it's justified, because it's taken time for new technology to get to the point where you don't have to be in a lab, where you can actually get data from, you know, with markerless systems now, you can get data in competition every day. And that's changed the ability, I think, for the biomechanics group to affect the team. The other reason I had low expectations was there's just so much that's unknown. I mean, Roger's group and others have done a lot of work over the last 20 years, but there's definitely more that we're going to learn over the next 20 years than we've figured out in the last 20 years. And so you're working in a space there's just a lot that we don't know. Like, most answers are not definitive black and white in this space. And that makes it challenging to think about, how do you best set things up in a space that's gray to have an impact, but not to overstate things, not to overclaim, not to get ahead of yourself. I think from what I mentioned, I think with the development and the spread now throughout Major League Baseball of markerless systems between Kinetrax and Hawkeye, we're definitely at an inflection point in terms of the quantity and quality of data that all of the teams in Major League Baseball have. I mean, we're not talking like 2x the amount of data. We're talking 100x, 1,000x over the course of a few years. And that, to me, gives us a lot of hope that we're going to be able to ask and answer questions that we have been able to ask and answer the last 20 years. I think you also asked about the challenges. I mean, depending on the approach you take, there's a lot to do. It's not something you can't really dip your toe in as a professional baseball team in biomechanics. You've kind of got to commit to it between the data acquisition, the technology implementation, the data acquisition, cleaning, structuring, the development of the team, and then thinking about all the things that Roger mentioned around culture and how you integrate things into the rest of the team. It's really hard to do this as kind of a side project. So lots of challenges along the way there.
Yeah, I think you both hit it really well. I think coming from the biomechanics side, for me, like my expectations were always really high. I'd spent 10 years in college studying this, loved it. And I was like, oh my God, we have to use this. I have to show you how great it is. But we run into that same situation where your coaches are former players. The players have played the game for so long. Why do I need this? This is going to take my job. This is going to make it so I can't coach anymore. And you're going to tell me what I have to do. And I think that's the biggest misconception coming into new teams and buying into this information. So when you talked about, it's not about just, hey, this guy falls down the mound. It's how can we measure this? What's their center of gravity? What's their stride length? What's changing? And then taking those conversations to what the coach is seeing, more than not, they're right. I tell my coaches 99% of the time, you're exactly right about what's happening. But if I can give you objective information to back that up, so that when you make a change, we can measure what that change is, that's where we make a difference. Subjectively making changes is really cool. But if we can objectively say we made this amount of change and we did this with an athlete, that's so much cooler, right? We're now able to exactly look at how much we're making an improvement for an athlete. We can have these outcomes, we can have these measures and understand what we're trying to measure so that the entire group is bought into what's happening. And with that, like we talked about what we're doing, what we had to work through, but when you see this amount of information, like it's brand new to an organization, and you're seeing all of this data come through, what was that period like where you're trying to look at all this information and then decipher the amount of information that biomechanics really can give? Because we're getting full body, we're getting every joint, we're getting all the torques, all the forces. What's it like trying to look at that and say, all right, we're going to bring it into this because this is what we're looking for. How was that process the best? Without giving away any information, we're all trying to win. But what was that process like, looking at all the information, figuring out this is what we're trying to do? I
mean, I would start by just saying that's totally still ongoing, right? Like there's still, it feels very much still feels like there is a lot of opportunity, a lot of low-hanging fruit, a lot of questions we want to ask and answer that we haven't. So it's definitely still ongoing. It's in terms of how it's for us, it's a combination of our team, our biomechanics team, which is awesome, fantastic team that's already thinking about maybe where the most impact can be out of the gate, but also the feedback from the coaching staff and the sports medicine group. I mean, it's definitely two-way. Like the best starting points, sometimes they come from the performance science biomechanics crew looking at things and saying, wait a minute, this is what I'm seeing. And a lot of times they come from the coaching staff or the sports medicine group saying, hey, something's off here. Can you guys take a look at this? And then there's this like back and forth that all of a sudden generates really interesting insights or changes. So that big picture, we're still very much figuring out, there's still way more to do than has been done.
Yeah, I think echoing Colin's comments were, it is ongoing. I will tell you this, I know it was, so teams are competitive, not only on the field, but in the front office. I know that when we started biomechanics, it was myself, another athletic trainer, a strength and conditioning person, and a team physician, and that's it. And I would tell you exponentially right now, our front office and our coaching staff and our medical staff have grown 10x, right? So we're competing with other teams because our front office sees other teams spending dollars in this area. And I think it's very important to include the analytics staff. When we first dove into analytics, probably 10 or 12 years ago, like all in, it was picking their brains. Like I would sit with those guys all the time and just pick their brains to say, okay, what do you guys think matters? And then I'd go to our physicians and I would say, what matters to you? our athletic trainers, what matters to you, our strength, what matters to you, and try to put all of those pieces as a collective philosophy for a organization to say, okay, we're going in this direction. Granted, GMs get fired for not winning. Managers get fired for not winning. The name of the game is to win, but the name of the game in organizations is to develop talent, is to acquire talent. How do we do that? To retain talent and develop talent. And because we all know that we want players to perform at the major league level at a very, very high level to make minimum salary. We don't want them to make $50 million a year. We want them to make $750. And so that's where like small market teams like the Milwaukee Brewers, like that's where we have to invest in, because we can't keep going at trade deadlines or free agency and buying the $200, $300, $400 million athletes. We just can't do that. And so how do we do it internally? And you have to have all those pieces collectively going in the same direction to understand where you're going to go and what you're going to focus on. And going off of biomechanics is we want to look at elbow valgus stress, and we want to look at shoulder shear force and torque, and then how kinetically it works. That's what we want to figure out. And we want to put a value on that, by the way, on a human being. That's what we want to do. That's the end goal for the Brewers. It's super hard to do.
Yeah. And I think this leads into the next point, because you both just touched on this, and it's the communication point.
Yeah.
We're at a point where there is so much information. There's so much verbiage within biomechanics. It's so, I don't know, overly complicated for no reason. I'm coming from a biomechanist, but how do we make sure that we're communicating the right things to those areas? And what areas should we involve when we're talking about biomechanics? How do we make sure that we're all on the same page and getting the right things done?
Yeah, I think so. In my notes here, I have, okay, so when I was the vice president of medical, I want a 30K overview, 30,000 foot overview of what's going to work. And I want to do that to my president, to the GM, to other senior levels, and then start tiering it downward, right? To get down to the granular level of people that make the impact with athletes. And that's medical personnel, sports performance, strength and conditioning, coaching staff. All of those individuals understand things to the level that they can understand. Granted, former coaches or former players, you know, you got to get it down to their level a little bit. But how do we give them the most important facts to actually evoke meaningful change? That's what we want from them. And that at a higher level, we want them to know, hey, this is what we're doing at a high level. And we've informed the people on a cascading downward scale of what they need to do to implement. And that's worked for us. Granted, I mean, exponentially getting larger and larger staffs and people getting in rooms like this, right? I don't think we do that enough. I'm old school. I'm not a Slack guy, right? Like, just come to my office and talk to me for a minute. Like, we'll probably solve it in 5 minutes. And I don't want to go, 5 Slack channels deep and not remember what I said. But like, those are the things of the interaction and the communication piece of this that we can solve by idea dumping together to understand how we can get this to a point where the organization's comfortable with the direction that we're going.
Slack is the answer to everything. I think that's very true. I mean, lots of folks involved. We kind of have tried to open the aperture more internally than you might, we've found that there are more people interested in this than we maybe you would just expect based on job title. And it's a new enough field that you can have people develop enough expertise and new expertise that you wouldn't have picked them out just by going through Media Guide. And so we're trying to open the aperture a little bit and let folks have access to the education and the tools and see what emerges a little bit, see who grabs on and all of a sudden is in really interesting dialogue with the performance science group or with the coaches about things. I think I understand Roger's point on the coaches and players and the challenges over 25 years. I can't imagine 20 years ago. Our experience is that with our staff, and there's a lot of appetite right now. And I think it's just people are coming up with it more often. They're seeing more of it. And my guess is that that's going to be even more true with players. I mean, we're starting to see it with players asking questions and who have had experience with either in amateur space or with external vendors, with that they've, hired on their own. And so I think that is going to increase a lot over the next 10 or 15 years as the kids who are now on those travel ball teams and are getting mocapped at age 11 come up and start asking questions right out of the gate. So I think that is shifting.
And I will add, so we had a USA U18 baseball tournament in Milwaukee, and I asked one of the parents how much money was invested to get their child to U18 Team USA, and it was $550,000. So guess what? You got to break even in the draft. You have to break even in the draft. And so there's a lot of money that these parents are investing in their children. And now externally that we have more and more technology coming around, right? I think every kid that I see has a Whoop band on, and, they're going to a performance coach, they're going to a pitching coach, they're going to a hitting lesson, they're going to a strength person on their own, and their parents are facilitating that. Those kids are now coming into organizations and they're like, well, this is what made me successful thus far. And then we as organizations have to get them to buy into what we're trying to do to develop them to get to the big leagues. And I think that sometimes that gets lost a little bit in translation when we start drafting kids. But, I think every organization tries to do their best to put their arms around the child or the kid and just say, hey, we know what's best for you. Let's keep going. We're going to value your input of what you did before, because we can't discount that because you've been highly successful. But, how do we create that culture of all these 180 kids that are in minor league baseball?
Yeah. And from my side, so I'm a little different than both of them. That's why we put this panel together, is to bring different ideas and different personalities into this. And I'm a biomechanist, I'm a sports scientist, but I'm a mix. I'm front office based, but on field a lot. So for me, the communication starts with those players and with the coaches understanding what I'm about, why I'm here. So when I'm talking to a player and they're asking me questions, they very quickly get the sense that I'm not here to make changes. I'm not here to just change things to change them. We're trying to figure out what's going to make them the best and make them the most money. My success isn't determined based on how many guys we can change. It's how big of contracts we can get and how many guys we can keep on the field. It's about that performance and about keeping guys from getting injured as much as we can. So starting with the relationships and getting people to understand that and having those conversations to understand where we're coming from with this information is really, really important. And I've talked about this every time I talk within a panel. When a player buys in, when a player understands what we're there to do with them, then it makes a lot more sense. Then the coaches see that. And I talk to my players a lot. The data that we're getting, any data that I collect as a sports scientist or biomechanist, is their information. They own that data. They're letting me borrow it to try to help make them better. Same thing we're doing with all of this. We're borrowing information from them. They're letting us collect it so that we can do what we can to help them perform. And then it's up to us to have those conversations so we do what we can for that athlete. It's up for us to get in a room once we get biomechanics to break it down with the strength coach, with the AT, with the coach, to say, hey, what are we seeing? What can we do as a group to make them better? What drills can we do on the cage? What drills can we do on the mound? What can we do for extra arm care? What can we do in the weight room to get them more rotational velocity or whatever it may be? But we can find all of this through biomechanics. So creating that communication, creating those relationships so that it doesn't have to be sit down in an office. It's, hey, what'd you see from this game the other day? And we can have a casual conversation on the field and we can come up with solutions on the fly. We don't have to create Slack messages. I'm a little partial to Slack, but I'm a much bigger fan of an organic conversation around the information, because that's where we find real input and we're getting things done in a quick manner. I sometimes get lost in Slack because there's so many conversations going on. But in either way, as long as we have those communications line open, as long as we're talking as a group and we're making sure that everyone is on the same page, that's where we make the best impact for player development and for performance and injury prevention. And that's kind of where I'm seeing this. So we talked about communication. We talked about how we've used biomechanics, the current state. So I'm I'm more up to date on this because I peruse Twitter as much as I can. I see everyone on LinkedIn tell me all the new drills that they've designed with PVC pipes and tennis rackets and whatever else they may care about for biomechanics. But when we're talking about current state of biomechanics, we're seeing teams with markered labs. We're seeing teams with markerless data. Hawkeye's now in every stadium. Teams have Kinetrax. There is now 1 camera systems where you can use your iPhone to get it. There's 2 camera systems. There's all these different things. How do we take this information from any of these different aspects and make a decision on what we're going to use and how we're going to use it? Because everyone's claiming to be the best. All of these companies say that they can do exactly what you need to do and what we're going to try to use. Again, not trying to point out exactly what we're using as clubs, but when you're looking at these, what are we really looking for to make a decision on what we want to use for our athletes?
Yeah, I think that's the $1 million question, right? I think that, biomechanics has come from the 42 marker system, and I think that's the gold standard, right? I do think that you can actually vet other companies against that. We went down the bat sensor road for a while and vetted that in motion analysis lab. But you're getting markerless stuff now that's high quality, valid and reliable data. And how do you as an organization have to figure out how are we going to use this, interpret this, digest this, and display this data to people within the organization that's going to make meaningful change. And we want to have that closed circuit, relatively quick feedback loops on those individuals, because like 20 years ago, it took us 9 days to do 20 guys to process their data. Now we can turn it around instantaneously, right? And make meaningful change. And doing pitch design with pitchers to understand how we can give them another piece in their arsenal to get people out, right? That's what you want. Pitchers, we want our pitchers to do is to get people out and conserve energy and do it over a lot of games and have them available for all those games. And that goes into workload management, and biomechanics has a piece in that. So that's how we do it at the Brewers, is to try to get those quick feedback loops and make decisions relatively quickly based upon the valid, reliable information that we have at hand.
Perfect. I think that's a great answer. And I think that leads into we've talked about the biomechanics. We talked about what we do. We talked about how we determine what technologies that we use. All of us have seen the markerless mocap. All of us have seen the mocap, how we're getting kinematics, how we're getting all this. But what's next? What's the next biomechanics frontier? What are we seeing? There's a lot of technologies you can use for biomechanics. What haven't we talked about? What's useful that we haven't mentioned so far?
Well, I think you asked about the one iPhone system. I think there are a lot of those that are being developed right now. Kind of more broadly describe it as like a light system, a light markerless light. And there are already flavors of that out there, but to take it to the extreme, you have, a single person with a single piece of technology in their back pocket that can somehow extract useful and meaningful information in any setting, in any lighting conditions, without being an expert. That'd be phenomenal, right? We're not there yet, but that's one of the more exciting spaces. I think it's actually like the value of that today is here, and the value of that goes up as the really high quality markerless systems are deployed more broadly and become better, because then you have more and more, you already have the systems and processes set up. You already know what you're looking for, and you can use smaller technologies that maybe have more limited capability, but they give you exactly what you want on a low budget and in any setting. So I think that's one of the most exciting places we'll see things go. And probably that will go heavily into the amateur space early too, just because they don't have the budgets and costs to go all in.
Yeah, and to go off of that, I know that, high school and college, when we're scouting some of those, it's the parents, doing this to their child and uploading it to a YouTube channel to a college or university. And then that college and university has people in their building to interpret that data. So the role of the amateur scout is becoming less and less because we have such really good technology, and we're not doing the 20/80 grading scale of, I think he's this because I held the radar gun and this is what my eyes see and I timed him to first base. And we're using all that technology to inform us to make the best decisions, right? And so I think that's the next frontier, as you said, Colin, that organizations can piecemeal some of these things together to answer the right question as we started this discussion.
Right. Yeah. And for me, like, we're talking about the next thing, right? We're talking about, we've seen motion capture. We're seeing it take off. We're seeing the animations when we're watching the game from MLB. We're seeing all of this happen. What about force plates? What about EMG? What about using any of these other types of tech? Like, how can we start to integrate those more? I know certain teams have dived in a little more with certain pieces of tech in the past, but where is that next frontier? Where's the next thing we're going to see really blow up after we get through markerless motion capture, the motion capture, and seeing how they move? What's the next big thing?
I mean, I can't give you one great answer there, but I do think it's going to need to be integrated, like tightly integrated with the motion capture, because, you know, whether it's, you know, synchronized capture or it's so that you're actually, you know, beginning to look at the player from multiple angles. Maybe it's force plates, maybe it's something else. You look from multiple angles where it's all synced. Like you have the video, you have the motion capture, you have the force plates, you have the EMG, you have whatever it is, and it's all completely synced so that you can truly analyze the same movement from multiple perspectives. And that integration is not easy either, regardless of the technology. So that might be the first place that it really goes.
Absolutely.
I think from my chair now on the outside looking in, I think it's GPS monitoring. I think it's convincing players to wear a device that tracks them throughout the day. You know, we at the Brewers have done that with a certain company. And you wouldn't be all surprised if baseball players just stand around a lot. That's all they do is stand around. But when they need to move, they have to do it really quick and at a high velocity, at a high rate. And, you know, I was the chairman of the MLB EMR committee, and the #1 injury in baseball is hamstring strains. By far, we can't figure it out. Can't figure it out. We've done papers on it. We've done all this stuff on hamstring strains, and guess what? They still happen. And when do they happen? In spring training in the first 3 weeks of the season, at the end of the season, which tells me they're not prepared for spring training because we think they're ready. And you guys see this in your chairs. They're not ready. I say every spring training, wow, how weird is it to put some spikes on today? Because they haven't done it yet, right? They go to work out, they go to hit, they do all this stuff. They don't do it in a 5-hour span every day. And you just see the attrition of that. And so, and they, at the end of the season, they get hurt, right? Because of the fatigue. And so we have to figure out load management. We have to figure that out. And I will tell you this, I had the opportunity to be with the Liverpool soccer team for a few days. Yeah, they figured it out. They have a dashboard. They can tell you when their midfielder can play 50 minutes a game. And their managers bought into that. Their coaches are bought into that. I think in baseball, that's where we need to be.
I have one more, which is more in the Star Trek category, but you know, by far the piece of information that I wish we had and is serial imaging, you know, across, you know, of key parts of the body across over time. And I think there'd be so much to learn if you had that today. You get an image when somebody's hurt. You get an image when somebody's being evaluated. But if there were a technology out there that allow you to super low cost, completely unobtrusively develop a longitudinal imaging record, I think you'd actually see really big leaps in our understanding of the relationship between efforts on the field, between workload, and between what's reported as pain or stress and actual injury. But it's still in the Star Trek world for this point. So that's where I'd leave it for now.
Well, I will say this too, Ethan. You know, once October hits and you're not in the playoffs, you don't see your players October, November, December, January, and February. You don't see them for 5 months. You have to entrust that they're doing what they're doing, and you give them plans in the off season, and you do all that stuff. And you do an entrance physical, and we put them through all these anthropometric measurements and all this stuff, and they're just not ready. But you can't say to your $20 million guy, you're not going to play in spring training because you're not ready. Right. And it's hard to build conditioning, endurance in competition. You just can't do that. And that's why here in Arizona, the 15 beautiful complexes, you want to try to drive as many players there as you possibly can in the off season, because the off season is a season without games, right? You're just not in competition, but you have to prepare for competition. And I think that's the swing over the last 5 or 7 years is we've just built great complexes down here to drive players here. And we have in the past highly recruited players to come here on a monetary value to come to our complex, right? Because we want to have our eyes on them. Absolutely. And those are the guys that we've spent in the draft $3, $4, $5 million on that are 18, 19 years old that can't train the way they were in high school. And we have to help them. We have to educate them to help them develop.
Yeah, I think you both hit this really well. I want to touch on something. You mentioned how much baseball players stand around by using GPS. I've had a little dabble in GPS as well. And the amount of time they spend walking between fields for practice, especially instructs, is astronomical. So we had to completely change an algorithm once because the load from the day, like total distance, and then based on velocity, they were walking like almost a mile just walking. And some of that was just them standing in the dugout, just pacing back and forth while they were waiting for a drill to end, right? So there's a lot that comes into play when we're talking about this workload and what's happening. And GPS is one aspect. We have force plates where we can monitor jumps. We can see how they're moving down the mound. We have force plate mounds now. We can put force plates in the batter's box. We can see all these different things with how they're interacting with the ground. We can use something like EMG where we see muscle activity. So we can see how they're firing each muscle and what the pattern of that is. There's a lot of things that we can build in that we can really dive into how the body is moving and how the body is working. So I think you guys gave great points on that and how there is a chance for this to grow and how sports science and biomechanics is becoming more integrated, because this is coming from two non-biomechanists. This is coming from people who see how the data can be used. And I think that's really what's the most important, is how you guys view what's happening. So we have about 22 minutes. So we'll probably finish up with this question, then we'll let the audience ask some. Overall, from your experience with biomechanics, what have we learned, right? What are the successes? What are the failures? How have we grown from where we started to where we are today in your point of view? Like what was that path and how do we grow?
So I think biomechanics, and I think an attribute to Dr. Jimmy Andrews, which was all of our team physicians, him and Lou Yoakum, Dr. Lou Yoakum, but you got to give a ton of credit to Dr. Gary Fleissing. Dr. Fleissing at the Alabama Sports Medicine Institute is a pioneer of baseball biomechanics, and he told us, you know, hey, it's 8,000 degrees per second. Ethan, you're the expert on this, but if you took your shoulder off and spun it around 20 times in 1 second, that's how fast you throw, right? Wow. Okay. How do we control that? Because we don't want that thing just flying off. So what do we do? Right? So how do we build it from the Dr. Ben Kibler model of the ground up? Mm-hmm. How do we start building that? And how do we use proprioception and muscle coordination to figure out that they couldn't just blow their ulnar collateral ligament at every pitch, right? Yep. So they throw at 8,000 degrees per second at 64 Newton meters. And if you put them in the lab under cadaveric dissection, it's 32 Newton meters that they could blow their UCL out. So you have to have this muscle coordination. And as a clinician, we have to figure out how best to do that, right? And that's in coordination with your physician, your strength conditioning people, all those individuals that help that player and educate that player to tell them what we just said. Like at any given time, you can blow your UCL out, right? And granted, we have a lot of acute stuff, but we have a lot of acute on chronic. Right? As I said before, those 8-year-old kids that are throwing just tons of innings and tons of pitches, you know, it takes a toll on their little bodies and not closed epiphyseal growth plates, right? And so how we move forward in the next 10 years with all of this information is going to be interesting to say, yeah, we have all this stuff, but did we solve? And I think the great minds in this room, asking the right questions and providing the right solutions to the age-old question of how to keep baseball players healthy and increase their performance, to make them available every day or every 5 days or back-to-back in bullpens is essentially important, because you can see the downtick right now of relievers. There's not relievers that throw 80 times a year. There's just not, right? You want guys to come for 2-inning saves back-to-back nights. That would be great, but you don't get that, right? But you have to affect everything else that they do during the day, like walking or flat ground or long toss or working in the weight room. I was just in spring training today at our complex and followed a pitcher around for 15 minutes. They did zero work, right? And other pitchers are just getting after it in the weight room. But what really matters is what you do on the mound. Doesn't matter what you do off the mound, but it accounts to your total capacity.
Yeah.
That's what we have to understand.
Perfect.
I give you a couple things. One, I think from a content perspective is, and this is echoed in baseball more broadly, you can be successful in baseball so many different ways, right? It's such an interesting sport because you have people with completely different, physical profiles who succeed in very different ways in very different positions, different roles with the teams. And biomechanically, I think one of the more interesting things is there are lots of ways to do it too, right? And when you're looking at a player, you're looking at that player. I mean, there are common learnings, but I think what's really emphasized is the need for kind of mass customization. Like the analysis is a per player analysis. And I think that's exciting. It's challenging to do on a broad scale, but it's really exciting. In terms of actually like the impact within an organization, we've talked about this already, but it's completely has to be a team effort, or, this technology that's been installed is just going to have zero impact. There's got to be buy-in across the organization. There's got to be people who have different areas of expertise and long tenure and long relationships who are able to hear the information, interpret the information, communicate the information. And that's when you, I think, start to really see traction. So those would be the two kind of points I'd emphasize.
Yeah. On my side, I think it's the most exciting time to look and start to dive into biomechanics that we've ever had, because it's now becoming more readily available. We're seeing this information. We can dive into it. We can start to create more models. We can start to create how all these things tie together, both with injury, both with performance. So we're now able to see all of these new things. We're able to dive into it even more. And now every team, almost every team, has a biomechanist or a sports science on staff, right? So they're all growing, they're all building. So we're seeing this grow and we're seeing all of these new things come up. So it's super exciting for me. And I've been a part of both successes and failures. We've been able to make changes where we've seen a guy start to deviate from his norm. We can get him back and he can finish pitching the rest of the year after having a little bit of elbow soreness after an outing. So we've seen that. We've also had the failures where we missed something or a guy didn't come up, or there's all these things that we're learning from this information. And no, we're not going to be perfect, but what can we do to help maximize our players the best in terms of performance, in terms of injury risk? And that's what's the most exciting for me right now with where we're at. So I think that's right at 45 minutes. So it leaves us 15 minutes or so for questions. Is that right? Cool. Center.
Something about joint rotation of a course that my mind interpreted as, hopefully going to tell me about this, that the live body can do something that we literally tear the tuning of the quote apart. And so it must be something to do with muscle coordination in that particular motion. Did I understand that right?
Yeah, so if you do cadaveric dissections in the lab and you put what we have is a telos device, which is a valgus stress meter, and you put 32 Newton meters on it, it's going to tear. In humans, in pitchers, we know from forces of valgus stress in the biomechanics lab that those forces can be up to 64 Newton meters. So for muscle coordination and efficiency of biomechanics, that doesn't happen. And we as clinicians need to ensure that we train the muscles to actually fire at the right times to protect the joint.
Yeah, so we've basically seen from these studies that we create enough valgus torque every single pitch to tear the UCL. So what we're doing is being able to create coordination around that ligament to protect it as much as we can.
So kind of going along, you need to, in baseball, we need to get better with work management, load management. Where do you see the game potentially improving with that, and how would you sort of start that?
So I think we've dove into this over the last 4 years super heavily, is the availability of players on a daily basis and the risk of injury and the prevention of injury to try to keep those players on the field. In Major League Baseball, you get hurt, you still get paid, right? NFL, you can get released. They just have to pay medical bills for you. So we as an industry have a high incident of hamstring strains on position players. And, you know, when those guys are out, you got to backfill a position, right? You got to pay that guy to come up while you're still paying this guy. So that then leads you to having conversations with your president, your GM, and your owner of, I'm paying this guy 20 million and why is he out? So, yeah, I think to your question is the availability component of this is really what we need, is to try to figure out everybody's player-centric availability profile of what they can do, their capacity every day, if they're in competition every day. Or if you're a pitcher, you're a starting pitcher, it's every 5th day. How do you modify what they do on day 1, 2, bullpen day 3, 4, start? Like, how do we, I think we have a good guesstimate, but I don't know if we have a good process.
Only thing I'd add to that is just, I think you mentioned it earlier, or maybe Ethan mentioned it, complementing the data and the information that we have on in-game workload and on practice workload, which is harder to capture than in-game workload, with the data that we don't have, or we have in kind of slim measure on what happens off the field. I think you need a full picture. It's not easy to do. Like, that gets into a whole bunch of other questions around what players want to share when they're away from their job. But ultimately, to get a full picture, you'd want to have a real understanding of what's going on away from the field too.
And to add to that, probably, I don't know, 15 years ago, we did biomechanical motion analysis in one of our hitting tunnels, right? So we did that. We had the guy throw 30 fastballs, all good, 80%. And then we did a live BP where we tented the mound on a BP field, and we did it, and we saw joint shear forces exponentially go off the chart, because then now they're in competition against a hitter. And that changes the focus of the pitcher to say, I got to get him out. I'm just not throwing to a glove. And I think that component of now having in-game markerless motion capture is what we were looking for 15 years ago, right? And we looked at it and it was like, okay, so now we're going to add X amount to this load because of what we saw in live batting practice and spring training.
Yeah. And so we talk about this a lot. We're getting all this data from in-game, and how do we correlate what's happening in practice and off the field? So we have StatCast. We can see how much they're running. We can see where they're getting it from. We can get it from base running, from fielding, from all these different aspects. And that's just one piece. We know game is where they make their money, but what are we doing in practice? How are they supplementing? What kind of workload are we getting? So the real key is being able to combine the two to have a global perspective of what the athlete is doing throughout all of their work. And that's what every team is trying to figure out right now.
Question about two aspects that were mentioned earlier in the speech,
that presentation. One being the collection of biometric data to help mitigate player injuries, and then the second being that the player owns the information collected with them. My question is twofold. One, how has that affected both players' choice of healthcare options, assuming they get injured and have to go to surgery, or subsequently the choices that follow thereafter? And also, how does that affect the front office negotiations with the collection of biometric data, for example, arbitration or free agency negotiations?
Excellent questions. Can't use health data or performance data that you collect in arbitration. Okay. I will say this. If players have issues with that, I will tell them you need to make arbitration first. You need to get to year 4 because we're trying to help you get to there. And so each year players sign a disclosure form to release that data to the club and to the medical professionals that is assigned to that club in this disclosure form, that we can use that information to enhance their performance or reduce the risk of their injury. But you can't use it for arbitration purposes.
And I think to the point that Roger made earlier about kind of assessing injury risk with biomechanics, it's still very, very far from like a predictive science. It's you know, there are correlations, but there are correlations with lots of things, and there are lots of causes of injury. So we're so far away from being able to actually predict injury that it's not a factor for some of the things you asked about.
Yeah, from my side. So with every 40-man guy, based on the Players Association agreement, they have to sign a wearable tech waiver to have any data collected on them. Markerless data is excluded from that. But within all of this, for me, coming out as the sports science biomechanist, my verbiage to them is that they own the information because it is theirs. And within our tech agreements, I have it written every single time that if that player at any point wants his data deleted that's been collected, it'll be deleted. So for me, that's the ownership of them, so that they trust us, because that gives them more ownership to understand we're trying to use it for you. We're not using it for anything else. At any point when you're uncomfortable, say it's out, it's out.
So I think when we talk about the biomechanics, there's a rightful focus on pitching. I was wondering what kind of work was done on things like defensive throws and defensive movement, and if there's anything in the data acquisition changes that might either increase or enable your ability to look at that picture.
I think that leads to me. So we've done a little bit of work. The majority of biomechanics has been between pitching and hitting. That's where the main focuses have always been. Within defenses, we started to look into first steps, route efficiency, things like that, which can be classified as biomechanics, because we're looking at distance over time and how efficient they are. So we have dove into that. But in terms of mechanics of running and that kind of stuff, we're still not there. We don't know. We know where the money is made is on the mound and at the plate. And we know that base running can be that. But in terms of defensively, like at times we want to dive in, but the best place for us right now is currently on the mound or at the plate.
You don't have to go into the details, but I'm wondering, do you guys feel like in-game Hawkeye data is that like one where it's reliable enough to make decisions off of? And how do you guys feel about determining that there's something that's reliable enough to make a call off of?
I personally don't think Hawkeye data is where it needs to be to make decisions on for like playing time or looking at injury risk yet. I know that we're doing some work with marker to Hawkeye to actually see what the variance may be, but I just don't think it's there yet with some of the, and I would defer to our tech guys about the variables of Hawkeye. I know it's exciting to some clubs because you can get data on opposing players. That's
so coming from my side, I'm not gonna go one way or the other, just for points of proprietary information that I'm still using within the club. Within any of these biomechanics technologies, we assume that it's not accurate until we prove otherwise. So I can't give you an answer saying yes or no. But you will see, I know there are teams that use it very heavily. I know there are teams that are still dissecting it and figuring out what they can do for it. So I do know of clubs that are using it heavily. I do know of clubs that are using something like Kinetrax or otherwise. So there's a lot of things out there. I can't tell you for sure. If you just looked at a joint angle, you could say 100% this is correct, because all of our teams, everything we're doing with that information, we make our own corrections, we make our own adjustments to make it so that we feel it's the most accurate.
First of all, the mic wasn't even on, so there's that. Secondly, it does also help a lot if you have your mouth a lot closer to it, not on it, closer to it. So if you need to adjust, or if you need to take it out of the stand, you are more than welcome to. Because clearly I'm a lot shorter than these guys, and I said it for my height, so.
Thank you so much. I have a question about, I think, competitive advantage, as it seems that you change teams periodically, new jobs, new teams, and have also mentioned that you're trying to protect this very more granular information. I'm just wondering how that works. Are there, agreements that you have, formal or informal, to protect information, or how does that play out in baseball operations, player development?
Yeah. So as the guy who's now moved with 4 different clubs, it's interesting. So we have the non-disclosure agreement when we're there, so that we're not talking to other clubs about the information that we're gathering. But we're also at a very interesting point because players get traded. So a player goes from one team to another, or a coach goes from one team to another, and those players are different. The player can have the report from their previous org and be like, hey, this is what they gave me. And you're like, oh, so this is what the Giants do. Cool, right? So from my aspect, none of my reports have directly transferred over. The ideas can be moved, the ideas can be refined and rebuilt, but anything directly built within that organization stays within an organization. And then something that might look eerily similar is just built the second time out. So within all this, we are very secretive. We do keep a lot of things from each other. We're all very tight. We all know each other. So it's really interesting. When we go to dinner, it's like, oh, like, how's it going? And you're like, oh, cool. But I can't tell you about that. And you're like, okay, cool. But there is a note of secrecy, because we are trying to be the top one out of 30. There's only 30 clubs. So what can we do to get that next advantage?
I think that the ideal panel, we would have had awesome videos of our players up here with graphics and really made it, very specific and interesting, but we can't because of exactly this question. I do think one thing to keep in mind is the field's moving really fast and information gets stale really fast. And so that does kind of mitigate the risk as well.
I would add, when people move from team to team, you're always fearful that they're going to take your proprietary information and go to another team. But what outputs you may see from Ethan, and a player comes to you and says, this is what the A's are doing. You see the output, you don't see the process. Right. And I don't know his process. I see the output, which may be very similar to the Giants, but I don't know what ingredients they put for that output. I know what the Brewers did. We may have come to the same conclusions, right, but in 2 different highways. Yep. And so, you can only slice it so many times, right? Yep. And so,
and even if you get to the same conclusions, what you do from the conclusion to actually affecting things is probably very different. Yeah. So
I've talked about this a couple of times, not tonight, but you could look at all 30 teams. There's probably a piece of tech that every one of the 30 teams has, and all 30 teams are using it differently. They've all come to different conclusions. They're all finding the thing that they think is their competitive advantage. So it's really interesting to see that across the league, because there's a lot of text that all of us use. But when you talk to a player like, oh, we used it this way, I'm like, oh, we don't do that here. So all of us find our own competitive advantages from the same thing.
It's about asking the right question that your organization wants answered.
Yep.
Because 30 of them have 30 different philosophies.
I think we're at time. So one more.
Yeah.
Go.
Hi. Yeah. So I work for the Giants on the media side with NBC Sports Bay Area. And one of the things we get is a lot of questions from fans about why is this guy out? Why is he resting? And you hear a lot of in the media, well, before we didn't have this technology and players were playing more, pitching more, doing more stuff. And now we have this and they still get hurt. I think there's a disconnect between teams and media to how do we divulge that information so fans can understand what's happening and not think, well, this doesn't work or this doesn't apply because 30 years ago, my grandpa saw this guy pitch 120 innings and now we don't see that anymore. How can media and teams work together so fans, which is ultimately our, employers, understand what you guys are doing and we can explain it better?
I think it's called HIPAA. It's called HIPAA. From my seat was a head athletic trainer for 15 years, there's tons of stuff that go on behind the scenes, right? And I think one thing that I try to, when we give discussions like this is you see the output, the player can't play. And I tell this to our analytics group, you can't coach from behind a computer. All of these guys are humans, right? They may have not gotten a good sleep last night because their 2-month-old kid was awake all night, or they're not having a good time with the relationship with their girlfriend, or they just got off the road and got in at 4 a.m. and got to play tonight. Like, I don't think any of us would be happy with 5 hours of sleep, right? So there's different factors that go into this. And what the media sees is he's not playing today. And they ask why. I think hockey has a really good answer is this guy has a lower body injury, right? Or he has an upper body injury, or like baseball. It's like, oh no, he blew his UCL out. Like they divulge a lot of baseball and divulges a lot of information. Like the NFL has to have an injury report submitted to the league. We don't, right? We report to one person and that's our president or GM of baseball. Yep. And so what happens cumulatively under the ice is then the tip is what you see. There's a lot of stuff that goes into that and a lot of it's HIPAA protected data. And if the player wants to disclose that, he can do that because it's his personal health information.
I just said, I think the role that technology plays in that is still pretty minimal. Like those decisions are based on a lot of things beyond technology and, beyond what we've been talking about today. So that's one small piece, but it's kind of your question is a good one, which is like the broader set of rationales and how do you explain this? It's great. And how do you translate decisions that are being made today to the fans? It's a great question. How can we do that better? Look forward to continuing the conversation.
Yeah, I have 2 points and then we'll finish up. A lot of times those decisions on what gets going to the media isn't from any of our positions. It's from the president and how he determines to basically say what's going on. And 2, if a team ever decides to sit a player because of what I told them, then we're probably in a worse spot because I don't see a lot of what happens in the field. I don't see how they're moving. I talked about this a lot. You could look at biomechanics data and you could tell Mike Trout what's wrong with his swing if that data was anonymized. But would I change Mike Trout's swing looking at him on the field? No. Right. So it's about having a full picture understanding and bringing those groups together to make decisions like that instead of me like, oh, that data looks bad, take him out. Right. So I think that's it. Roger, Colin, thank you so much for your time.